where a lot of sales leaders fall down is that they go into that position and then they kind of get tempted towards the latter part of the pipeline, and they want to become the kind of, I'm going to come in and help you close. I'm going to be the super closer, right? I'm going to parachute in at the end, and you're going to get completely demoralized because you're like, oh, great, thank you. You come in and instead of playing a supportive role, you kind of start to take over rather than where you can really add value. And that's, in the early stages.
Welcome to Be Bold Branding, where we discuss the power of differentiating yourself through your own unique story and standout personal brand.
The lifeblood of any business is sales, and we take every chance we get to speak to the top thought leaders on that subject so we can learn what it takes to close the deals. Today, we're speaking with John Golden, a sales and marketing strategist, speaker, and best-selling author on the subject of sales. John has conducted over 1,500 video interviews of thought leaders for Sales Pop, which means we're about to learn not just from John, but from many top minds in the business. John is also the Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer at Pipeliner CRM.
John, welcome to Be Bold Branding.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. This is the subject that's everything, right? Like it started off, it's the lifeblood of any organization is sales, right? The most important thing. If I just had the good leads, John, if I just had the good leads, right?
Yeah. We have an old saying that, revenue fixes everything.
I love it.
Yes, it does.
That's so true. Well, hey, we want to know our guests a little bit. So you want to tell us a little bit about how you grew up, where you grew up, and what led you into learning and being a guru when it comes to sales.
So I came over here I'm originally from Ireland. I came over to the States during the dot-com era, came to Silicon Valley. I was really in the kind of product marketing area at the time. I came from the development center in Dublin, got into product marketing, did a lot of traveling around the States with the top salespeople, supporting them, which is what got my first real exposure to, especially to enterprise sales, because we were selling to big companies at the time. CBT Systems was the company, and we were selling computer-based training. And then after that, I moved and I spent a while at New Horizons Computer Learning Centers, which is at the franchisor. It's a franchise network. So I was at the franchisor, I was on the executive team there. And that was an interesting experience because, as you know, with franchising, you have to sell to the people who you want to sell to their customers, right? So it wasn't, and in that case, it wasn't a franchise network where corporate can impose exactly, here's what you sell, here's what the franchisees had a certain amount of autonomy, so you had to sell to them. And believe you me, selling to franchisees, I think is more difficult than selling directly to customers, to be honest. So I was there. I was at a K-12 startup for a while that was focused on teacher professional development. So I got some experience about trying to sell into school districts, and that, which is talk about a bureaucratic minefield. So that was another great experience. Then I was at the Mortgage Bankers Association for a while, and I ran their for-profit training and development wing. So we educated mortgage bankers, and we had certifications and ongoing training, and that went very well. That was a nice revenue stream for them. And then I took over. I was recruited to take over as CEO of Huthwaite, which is spin selling. Which at the time was owned by a parent company, Informa. And what is nice about it is they literally handed you a business, and they said, here's the operating profit that you need to generate. How you get there is entirely up to you. There you go. And so literally just hand you business. So and that was great. And then and I took over at the time of the financial crisis. So things were tough. But I managed to restructure that business and get it to where it was actually the most profitable it had ever been over the years I was there, despite the fact that we were in a recession, because some of the previous people had, we're talking about sales, but unfortunately they had focused way too much on the sales part and less on the infrastructure and the efficiency and productivity. So it was generating nice revenue, but the revenue was really unprofitable. So we turned that around and was there, for I think 6 to 7 years. And then the parent company, those companies got sold to a private equity group. I then moved back. I was in Virginia at the time, moved back to the West Coast. Started my own management consultancy business. One of my early customers was Nicholas from Pipeliner. He was a client. Then he asked me to come on board and help him to build the company. And I was like, okay. I was in the very early stages of building out my business. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. He's pretty persuasive. So he got me to come on board. And, we built this business together over the years. And then I took, helping with strategy. Then I took over the marketing function. So my experience, I think to sum it up, is I've been lucky in that I've had product development, product marketing, and sales experience also. I think that gives me maybe a 360-degree view. I've also been a buyer, right? So
right.
And so I think that's I think that's where maybe sometimes I have a little bit of a unique perspective, because I've been on both sides of the fence and I understand. I think oftentimes if you're only been in one area like marketing or only in sales, you maybe have a more limited view.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with that. Yeah, because you've saw that going through that different genres of business, selling is that's extensive. Most people don't have that much.
Exactly. Yeah. Coming from, I started out my career super, super young, selling vacuum cleaners door to door.
Excellent.
And then went into the radio world and sales and so forth. And I thought, wow, that gives me so much. The perspective is so different from those two things, but you've gone even layers deep into that, from not just selling the products and services, but selling the business that sells the products and services.
Yeah.
So, and then in the bureaucracy of, and red tape of everything. And so I'd say you've probably heard more no's than I have at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But what's interesting, the Hot White experience was particularly interesting because obviously it was spin selling based on the work of Neil Rackham, the best-selling business book of all time. He'd moved on, but we were consulting with large global companies, helping to train and prepare their sales teams. And what's interesting about that, here's two challenges. One is if you're selling sales training, well, your salespeople better be really, really good.
Right.
Because otherwise you're not going to go, I really liked their training, but their salesperson was really bad. Right? So that's there's a bit
the
of
product of their training sucks. In other
correct.
words, right?
Yeah. So that was a real challenge. Like our salespeople were representing the product, right? So we had to be really, really good about it. But here's the fascinating thing that I learned is that, especially when you deal with these big, large global corporations, and you think, oh, they must be really sophisticated, right? And when I was there initially, I'll be honest, I would go in with a little bit of an inferiority complex, thinking, we're going to come in and pitch this stuff, and it's quite fundamental. The original, like this spin selling itself, quite fundamental sales skills, and I would think, like, wow, these guys are going to be way beyond this. And then I discovered that it was actually the opposite. That there was a lot of fundamentals missing, that there wasn't good training, there wasn't good, sales managers weren't trained in how to be coaches and all of that. And so I quickly discovered that the fact was that the majority of organizations still lacked good fundamental sales skills, and particularly good sales management and coaching. Because as we know, people just, hey, you're the top salesperson. Cool. You're now the sales leader.
Yes.
Like, oh, great. That's fantastic. So now I've gone from being an individual contributor or working with my little team and hitting numbers, and now I'm responsible for all these other people who were my colleagues last week. Now I'm their boss. And no wonder it's like, I think it's a 15-month tenure for most sales leaders and new sales managers, because they just they flame out because they're not supported. It's not their fault, they're not supported. But those were some really interesting things that I found. Number one is there's a lack of fundamental skills, because I think what we do, and this is true for most things, is we get after a few years, we kind of forget the fundamentals. We don't do we don't do proper call planning anymore. We don't do proper research. We kind of start to wing things a little bit. Some of the things that we did in the past, we stopped doing them. And I think that's where organizations get into trouble, because you always have to revisit the fundamentals. And I always say to people is, when you're in a sales slump, go back and look at what were you doing when you were successful. Right?
Yes.
Go back and do an autopsy on that, if you like, and sort of go through, okay, here, and then compare it to what are you doing today, and see, are there things that perhaps you were doing that you're not doing anymore? And I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, you'll discover there are things that you're not doing anymore. So that the first point of turning things around is go back and figure out what you were doing that made you successful. What were the steps you were following, etc., and make sure you are still doing those. And if you do that, I guarantee you'll get some, things will start to pick up a little bit. You'll get back in a rhythm. But I feel like, we get over time, we forget that, and we start to, take shortcuts and sort of rely on our experience. And, instead of realizing that, and here's another thing I think is, process is a friend to salespeople. And sometimes they don't see it that way, unfortunately, because we've had all this, where people sometimes say, well, it's kind of an art, so I'm kind of an artist in my own way. I had one guy used to say, like, John, seriously, I sell the sizzle, not the steak. Okay.
Like what you're hearing? Hit that subscribe button and learn how you can change how you're seen and charge what you're worth.
And I think you're dead on, though.
What's that?
You're dead on. You're right. I even tell, as my company grew, my real estate company grew, because I did the branding through Tanya's, how we met, and so we still do the very things that we learned. She taught me 13 years ago or whatever. But I tell my executive staff now that was back then just with me, right? We were just hacking at this thing, and I'm like, hey, we can't forget like we used to do these certain steps. Our social media used to lead a pipeline. Like, we had all of these things, and now we've abandoned that. Like, we haven't done it. We have to get back to those things. Yeah. And you said something else that I really liked about the training. I had this boss, was a contract, right? He owned an auto auction, and we were the sales force, right? The auctioneers for it. And he would tell us all the time, all right, boys, we need to get back to the basics. We need to get back to the basics. And then we would leave, and it was always a joke. Okay, get back to the basics. Because he never told us what the basics were. So I'm like, well, we didn't know what we were getting back to, So I think you're right. Like, training systems, they make great salespeople, don't they?
They do. And unfortunately, like I said, when people are promoted into those positions, they're not trained properly, and not even trained in basic management. Forget sales for a moment, but just basic people management. And I think sometimes people think, oh, well, it's sales management. They don't need, basic management training. Of course they do. I mean, sure. Good management is good management at the end of the day. And then I think the other part is that where a lot of sales leaders fall down is that they go into that position, and then they kind of get tempted towards the latter part of the pipeline, and they want to become the kind of, I'm going to come in and help you close. I'm going to be the super closer, right? I'm going to parachute in at the end, and you're going to get completely demoralized because you're like, oh, great, thank you. You come in, and instead of playing a supportive role, you kind of start to take over, rather than where you can really add value. And that's, in the early stages, making sure things are qualified properly, coaching. And the thing about coaching is most people are not trained in how to coach.
Right.
And especially in sales management. But I mean, it kind of goes across the board. Most people's last experience of coaching was, especially here in America, was in the high school, like their football coach or their volleyball coach or whatever, shouting instructions at them, just do this, do that, get over there. And that's what people think of as coaching, and they may tone it down, so not shouting at anybody, but they're still doing the same thing. They're kind of still saying, just do what I tell you to do and everything will be okay. Mm-hmm. And that's not coaching. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the problem. That's the fundamental thing, that's not coaching. Coaching is helping you, is helping me pull out of you. What do you think? What are you doing? Where do you think?
Yes, it's honing your talents.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this is a great segue into this question then, John. a lot of years I've been, when you own a business and when you are, whether you're doing sales yourself or you're training your sales staff, you are in sales if you own a business. So I've always had an affinity for that and just really have studied it to the point where I just wonder, okay, what is the best attribute for a salesperson, right? So that's a question to you. If you could only pick one of these attributes for a salesperson, which one of these three would you choose and why? Number one, persuasion. Number two, adaptability. And number three, listening.
Oh, listening by far. I mean, the other two are really important as well, but listening, I think, is the most important thing. And obviously, listening comes with asking good questions, right? And that's an important distinction there. But listening, because I think we've lost, and a lot of people have lost the power of active listening, right? Really. I mean, people think, listening itself is just a physical activity, right? Something comes in your ear and it translates, whatever. It's the other part. It's the actually, it's dissecting it, understanding it, validating it. And I think that's where people often fall down, especially new salespeople, because they feel like, oh, I have to keep talking and I need to answer. Although I ask questions, then I don't even give you a couple of seconds to consider your answer because I don't like silence, right? I'm afraid of silence. And then instead of me really listening to what you're saying, I'm thinking of, okay, where do I go from here? And so I think active listening, and unfortunately we live in a world today that we're so distracted, right? And I mean, how often have you had a conversation with somebody, you're standing face to face with them, having a conversation, and suddenly their phone beeps or something. In the middle of the conversation, they just drop down, they look at it, and then they come back to you, right? And that's considered okay behavior now, right? But the fact is now you're tuned out of that conversation. It's the same thing as when you're talking to somebody. If you're thinking about what am I going to say next, where am I going to go with this, instead of listening and trying to dissect what they're saying. And I would say there's one other trait that I'd add to that list of yours, because the others are important too, and that's curiosity.
Oh, I like that one.
Yeah.
I think if you're insatiably curious about the business of your customers, the business of business, the industries in, you want to find out more, you want to learn. I want to learn about what's going on with you, Mike, and you, Tanya, but I want to know more. I just don't want to know about the business, but I want to know how it affects you as well as a person. I want to get deep down. I also want to understand are the things that you're talking about, the issues maybe you're bringing up, are those ones that you really are motivated to solve, or are they just ones that you're just highlighting? You talk about, if you could, maybe I could, and that's always a key point, is to make sure that you're curious, that you keep going down layers, so you really get to where the issues really are, and you're not tempted to just jump in on the first thing that sounds like you have a solution for, right?
Agreed, 100%. I worked with a fence company one time, fence sales company, and the guy there told me, he says, "Oh, I sell fences because I talk about everything but fences." It's people call me out, "Hey, will you give me an estimate, build a fence?" And he said, they literally have to ask me, "Are you going to give me an estimate?" Because he talks about their kids, he talked about their life, and he talked about why they needed a fence, and he talked about anything except for how much fence was going to be until they finally asked him, And the other thing he always said, which I loved, is he said, "You don't want to be the first guy. You either want to be the first guy in the door or the last guy in the door. You don't want to be the guy in the middle." Because he said, if you're first, you teach them everything they need to know and everybody repeats you. And if you're last, you teach them something that nobody else thought of. And he said, if you're that dude in the middle, that's a tough spot.
Yeah, but it's a great point on the fence guy, right? Because I mean, that differentiates him. I guarantee you, everybody else just gives you a quote for the fence, says, "What do you want? Do you want vinyl? Do you want wood? How high do you want it? How square? Here you go." Send you over the quote. But actually asking about it, I mean, that's the difference. Like, why you want a fence? Like, what's going on? What are you doing? What's your lifestyle like? All of that thing. I mean, who would give you more confidence? The guy who just gave you the quote, or the person who actually decides to ask you some questions?
Seems like he cares about you. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And speaking of caring about you, nice segue, gentlemen, into another question. Can you share some of the most memorable or impactful interviews out of those 1,500 that you've done that you just felt like you made an impact?
Wow, yeah, that's a tough one at 1,500. But no, there are some, and it's the impact on the audience and the impact on me myself. Dave Sanderson, who was the last person off of you remember the Miracle on the Hudson when the plane landed
Yes.
on the Hudson. He was the last passenger off the plane, and I think that was so impactful because you think there is somebody who was just a passenger. It wasn't part of the crew, but he stayed to the end, helping other people off, and getting. And I think that selflessness like that in a very intense situation, I think that's really really impressive, and I think it speaks to the greatest traits in humans, if you like. And I think, and that and for me, those lessons translate is, you don't have to wait for a horrendous situation like that. Is you can be like that in your everyday life. You can be like that in sales. Just what we were talking about a few moments ago is that instead of thinking about me, I'm thinking more about you and how I can help you and how I can be of service to you. So that was one. There's another guy, Kevin Cotton, who he has spent like 6 months, a year or so with the Maasai in Africa, right? The Maasai tribe. And just what he learned from them, I just thought was absolutely fascinating, is that they don't wait. They use all of their senses. And he said sometimes you will see a Maasai warrior and he's just standing there staring out across the Maasai, across the plain or whatever, and looks like doing nothing, but is taking in all of the information about like what's going on, what he can smell, what he can hear, all of those things. And I just think that's another fascinating one, is the taking time out and being still and clear your mind and actually trying to understand what the world is telling you, what feedback you're getting, etc. So I think that's another fascinating one, and I think it points to we don't spend enough time with ourselves anymore, just with our own thoughts or with our just taking in the world around us, because we've got these silly little narcissistic phones in our pocket that are going, look at me, look at me, look at me.
Yeah.
And so I think that was really profound for me, is like taking that time out and listening to what the world's telling you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
I definitely think that's important. I like, for a guy like me, I have to have that. Like I have to have some of that, or I can't function. That's where I recharge my batteries. I have to do that.
Yeah, but the unfortunate thing is, as I always say to people, I hear so often people say, "Oh, the busiest I've ever been in my life. This is crazy." And I'm always like, "Well, are you though? Or are you the most distracted you've ever been in your life?" Because they're two different things. And I always say, I wonder if we did one of those old-fashioned time and motion studies where we had a guy with a clipboard come in and stand behind you and go through everything. Yeah. How much extra time do you think is in there that was spent checking the scores on your phone, or like, oh, look at that, there's panda video. That's
There's no doubt about that. I don't know why I did it, but just about a month ago, I pulled up, the 168 hours in a week. I mean, it's very rudimentary. Like, it's just kindergarten stuff, right? But I'm like, okay. And then I Googled how, average sleep, and I Googled, average time with kids and family time and stuff like that. And then you end up with like 70 or 80 hours unaccountable in the week, half of the week, unaccountable, that could be productive towards something, even if it is something like
staring
being
at the sky.
still.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you make a really good point right there. Are you as busy as you've ever been, or are you just distracted like crazy? And I think distracted would win out most times.
100%.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt. Well, John, you're this chat is fascinating. So I think we'd love to have you back again if you'd be willing to come back.
Oh, for sure.
And for now, though, tell the audience how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, John Golden. You can find me at pipelinersales.com. You can find me at salespop.net.
Oh, fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for taking time with us today. Love your insights.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Ready to change how you're seen and charge what you're worth? If you're not getting enough opportunities to meet with ideal customers, or the prospects you're meeting with just aren't ideal, it's most likely your brand that's holding you back. So if you're a coach, consultant, or expert who is on the rise, you need our ultimate guide to a freedom-based brand. Download it free now at brandfaceguide.com.